Okay, hi everyone. Give me a moment. I'm still tidying up some settings, but I'll start shortly. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, I apologize for the delay. I was actually trying to resize my Totoro, so it's bigger. Okay, so hi everyone. How's life on day what day is this of the circuit breaker? 16? Okay, let me check on attendance first before we start. How many do I have in the stream? Ooh, only 50-ish. Okay, I'll wait one more minute.
Hi, Kok Leong here. So, just a comment on the ICT matters. Currently, we have the figures reported for the day. Do we want to capture the cumulative figures as well? Because currently, this number looks at our responsiveness to a daily request, but it doesn't give us a sense of the overall unresolved cases in a cumulative manner.
Okay, hi. Sorry, I'm back. I went off for a while. Okay, I'm gonna start. I think we have about 70-ish now. So, yes, hi. Welcome everyone to today's lecture. And today's lecture is going to be on UN reforms. Okay, so that's what it will be on. Okay. Now later on, I'll give some special instructions with regards to this topic specifically. So yeah, do listen to it as it comes. Okay. First of all, some recap of what we covered on the International Court of Justice. So we looked at different causes that affected the ICJ's effectiveness. We also looked at what changed with regards to the nature of the ICJ's judgments and its effectiveness over time, and also what continued with regards to the nature of it. Okay, so cause and effect, change and continuity, the common historical concepts that we deal with. Now, this is going to be the final UN lecture ever. And yeah, so it's the last time I'll be lecturing all of you. Oh, I am so sad. Yeah, so really, this is the final lecture that you will ever have from me. And yeah, after this, Mr. Lok will take over for the final theme. So you won't be hearing from me again till very, very late into term 3. Okay, so this is also goodbye. Yeah. Oh. Okay, anyway, a disclaimer first of all that this whole area of reforms to the UN is a very new area of your history syllabus. Okay, by the very nature of the idea being reforms, uh, a lot of these things are going to be very current. It was only added in with the last syllabus revision, and many of the things discussed are also very current. Okay, as the process of UN reform is one that mostly emerged in the 1990s and is still ongoing today. And in response to Diraja's question, actually, it's this. Okay, so that's the special note I'm going to make about this particular topic, that this is also the common last topic that actually is no longer might, it will be cut from your A-level assessment in view of the current COVID situation. So schools are instructed to still teach it, but it will not be examined at the A-levels. Okay, so actually it's not a significant chance, it is. So yes, this is the common last topic that is removed for H2 history. So we still need to teach it, and because it does affect your understanding of the UN as a whole, but it will probably not be assessed. Okay, not probably. It will not be assessed directly, either in your school exams or at the A levels. Okay, but as I said, it will still affect your understanding of other topics, which is why we are still going to cover it. Everyone clear on that? Because that's the important note that I wanted to make to everyone, that actually this is the removal. To those of you J3s and those of you who know the A-level syllabus, you also realize that it's a completely useless removal. Because no one ever does a question in the A-levels on UN reforms anyway. Yeah. It's usually, most teachers will tell you to avoid it. Yeah, so actually, yeah, no difference. But yes, I mean, I just have to make this note that this is the area that will be removed from assessment, not from teaching, but from assessment. Okay, so everyone clear on this? Because it is quite important. Yes, we'll still cover it as per normal, it's just that this will not be assessed. Yeah. Okay, if not, I'm going to move straight into the lecture itself. And what we are going to look at today, as the name implies, are the successes and limitations of UN reforms in addressing different big issues that the UN has had in recent years. That means, how has the UN tried to reform to deal with the conflict between sovereignty and humanitarian intervention, that I'll talk about it later, and also how the UN has tried to reform to deal with great power politics within the UN, to deal with issues of peacekeeping, and also to deal with the rise of regionalism. That means regional power blocks like NATO and ASEAN. So how has the UN reformed to take account of all these trends in the world? Okay, so same thing, we're going to look at this in terms of our varying historical concepts. First of all, in terms of what factors would cause the UN to want to reform, what factors affect the the UN's ability to reform itself, how have certain challenges to the UN changed and persisted over time, and also what are the diverse perspectives on how best to reform the UN. This chapter is going to heavily focus on the third thing, the different perspectives on how best to reform the UN, because this is going to come out very, very strongly. Okay, because no one really agrees on which is really the best way to reform the UN. So I'm going to jump straight into the lecture itself. So first of all, I'll touch on this conflict between sovereignty and humanitarian intervention. Okay. Now, what is this issue about? Is actually, as the name implies, this. Now, the UN Charter says this about sovereignty. Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Can someone tell me, type it in the chat, what does this mean? Sovereignty, yes, but what does it mean? What does this mean? So what can the UN not do? No violence, yes, but beyond no violence, what else? Okay, so UN is not allowed to intervene unless the country themselves ask for it. Yes, we are getting closer. They can't fight. Okay, yes, we are getting closer. Look at the word domestic jurisdiction. Okay, yes, Mirel, I think Mirel has kind of nailed it, that the UN shouldn't be allowed to interfere in matters relating to sovereignty. That means if a state decides that something is a domestic issue, this is my own problem, the UN cannot intervene. Now, do any of you see a problem here? Especially since we just covered peacekeeping. What's the problem? Okay, and yes, I think many of you have also realized what is the problem here. That if I'm a dictator and I decide that I want to massacre 1 million people in my country, in theory, the UN cannot intervene, no? Yeah, I'm not kidding. In theory, the UN cannot intervene because I can just claim it's my domestic jurisdiction, it's my domestic affairs. If I want to mass murder people, that's my own problem. Okay, so I think many of you are starting to see the problems already with this. So this idea of sovereignty, that means the right authority of authority of a state to govern itself and determine what happens within its own territory. Okay, is often clashing with this idea. Okay, is often clashing with this idea of humanitarian intervention. That means the idea of sovereignty clashes with the idea of intervening in another country for humanitarian purposes to stop war crimes, genocide, civil conflicts, massacres, human rights abuses, etc. So it's kind of a loophole that, hey, you have the idea of sovereignty, but at the same time, you can't, you sometimes need to intervene in countries for humanitarian purposes. Okay? And yeah, so, how are you going to resolve this? That at the same time you have to respect sovereignty, but at the same time, what if there's genocides happening in another country and you need to intervene and that country insists that it's, you know, my sovereignty issue is none of your business. So you see how sovereignty and humanitarian intervention when it comes to the UN often comes into conflict. So a lot of UN reforms in recent years have been trying to square the circle in a sense, to try to resolve this problem. Okay? Basically, yeah, as Yui pointed out, how are you going to, solve a conflict if you cannot intervene in the first place? Okay, so that's that. So over the years, one of the biggest reforms that the UN has attempted to address is this idea that I'm going to bring forward very soon as to how to square this circle. How to solve this problem. Okay, because the UN Charter says that sovereignty is a key principle, so the only times where they can actually intervene is like self-defense or Security Council authorization, but this is very, very problematic. Okay, same thing with enforcing international law, the similar issues faced of enforcing decisions versus the overall issue of sovereignty. And so, one of the key initiatives that the UN adopted in 2005, led by Kofi Annan, was this idea of the responsibility to protect. This was a commitment adopted by all UN states in 2005 that, hey, there is a responsibility on the part of governments to prevent genocides, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So this was basically an attempt to prevent states hiding behind the issue of sovereignty. So what this says is that a government, a state, also has a responsibility to protect its own people from mass atrocities and human rights violations. That means if you are a government, you need to protect your population from genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Which also means that if you cannot protect your population, the international community has the responsibility to act. Okay? Or R2P. So this is a very reasoned thing that says that, hey, the UN actually can take collective action if a government doesn't protect their population properly from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and all that. Quite an interesting framework. Okay, and the implications of this is that it powerfully rejects the argument that you can hide behind the idea of sovereignty, because governments have a responsibility to protect its own people. And if you don't protect your own people, that is a breach of your duty, and the UN can intervene. Okay, wow, sounds like a perfect solution, right? But as with all things in reality, it doesn't work out so nicely. Okay, is this shit for real? Probably not. Okay, so the attempts to apply a responsibility to protect over the years, many recent examples like in Libya in 2011, where the UN authorized NATO to intervene. They toppled the Gaddafi regime that was perpetuating abuses against its own people, but chaos continued in the country, even till today. And once again, the familiar criticism that US, NATO, this is like once again a case of this idea of responsibility to protect being hijacked to serve Western foreign policy objectives and just an excuse for the US and the West to intervene militarily in countries. So you see familiar criticisms arise despite R2P. Furthermore, other examples here. In the Ivory Coast, ECOWAS in 2011, more attempts to apply R2P, but again the legitimacy of the use of force by UN peacekeepers, another familiar issue, also cropped up. Finally, a very famous one, Syria. The Syrian civil war, the rise of ISIS and all that for 2011 to the present, you would have heard that there's almost no UN action when it comes to it, because it was constantly vetoed by Russia and China. Because Russia and China, after previous cases of R2P being invoked, were increasingly very suspicious of US Western motives in invoking R2P. They feel that the US and the West is just using responsibility to protect as a pretext for intervening and changing governments they do not like in different countries across the world. So that's why they are increasingly suspicious of this, and the vetoing continues in the case of the Syrian civil war. Still ongoing today as well, and it got even more complicated because of the US partial withdrawal and Turkish intervention. Okay, so overall we see that this idea of sovereignty versus intervention, despite R2P being quite promising, is still a very thorny issue today. Questions remain like, is this kind of R2P humanitarian intervention illegal? Because it is a clear infringement on sovereignty. Basically the sovereignty argument yet again. And is it just a pretext or excuse for the US and the West to change governments they don't like? Okay, and also accusations of hypocrisy on the part of the Western powers, because they selectively decide when they want to invoke this or when they want to call for this. So once again, no clear solution. And this issue of sovereignty versus humanitarian intervention still plagues discussions in the UN today. Moving on, we are next going to look at UN attempts to reform to resolve this issue of great power politics, which we have heard so much about, and which we have heard so much angst about. Like, you're always right in your essays how great power rivalry, superpower rivalry prevents the UN from functioning effectively. So how has the UN tried to deal with this over the years? In many ways, but they constantly face problems too. So first of all, let's go through this idea of great power politics. It's the usual criticisms of how the Security Council is like unrepresentative, not reflective of the world, just a playground for great powers. It's undemocratic, the veto is unfair, the permanent five are too dominant, the usual stuff. In the post-Cold War world, there's also a new problem. And this new problem is that even though, due to the superpower rivalry during the Cold War, the UN had a very limited role due to the veto and the abuse of the veto, but even after the Cold War, there is continued veto abuse. What is often called the hidden veto. That means even though the Cold War is over, right, countries, especially the permanent five, or rather the permanent five, still often threaten to veto. So when the other countries in the Security Council know that they are about to veto or they are about to threaten to veto, they will not even raise the issue. So in some ways, even though there are fewer vetoes in the post-Cold War world, this is not because more issues got discussed. It's because they just simply choose not to discuss it because one of the permanent five has already expressed an intention to veto it. So it's like just threaten, and it's like this hidden veto. They are not actually vetoing. They just threaten that, oh, if you continue doing this, I'm going to veto. Yeah. And so the issue just gets swept under the carpet. So even though the post-Cold War had fewer vetoes, it doesn't mean that the Security Council was suddenly effective, because this hidden veto, the threat of the veto, still exists. Okay. Moving on, we also had the issue of what we call US unilateralism. The US as the sole unchallenged superpower in the world after the end of the Cold War. The unipolar world where the US is really unchallenged. And yeah, this hegemony increasingly leads to increasing US willingness to act unilaterally with or without the UN's approval. Okay, so what this means is that the US increasingly decides that it doesn't really need the UN's approval or your approval in general to do things it wants. Like in the case of its intervention in Kosovo with NATO, or its invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. None of this were actually done with UN Security Council approval. So this issue of American unilateralism or exceptionalism, that the US feels that it is unique in its position and does not need to seek your approval when it conducts its foreign affairs, is also increasingly a problem of great power politics in the post-Cold War world. So we see that we have three issues. Okay, great power politics and also offshoots of this like the legacy of the Cold War, the hidden veto, and also US unilateralism that still continue to plague the UN in the post-Cold War world. So how has the UN tried to reform to deal with this? Of course, one of the thorniest issues is the veto. So there have been calls in recent years to reform the veto system altogether. For instance, all sorts of proposals like abolish completely, restrict the veto use, concurrent vetoes. That means in order for a veto to work, two of the permanent five need to both veto. If not, it's not counted. And to be honest, the result of all this is dream on. The permanent five will never allow, in some ways, any reforms of the veto system unless their needs are satisfied. Okay, so many of these proposals have come to naught too. As a result, what kind of worked out a bit more, okay, as a compromise solution between the permanent five and their veto powers and the need to keep them happy by giving them the veto powers, and a more recognition of modern day realities, is there have been calls for what we call veto restraint on the part of the permanent five. That means calls by different countries to tell the permanent five to be a bit more responsible and restrain from vetoing too much. Okay, especially on issues regarding mass crime. So this is a bit more of a compromise that could work. That means appeal to their good conscience that, hey, don't do it too much. So in a sense, this was kind of what we have been moving forward towards in recent years. A veto restraint rather than any outright attempts to reform the veto system. Okay? Because overall, we see that there is great resistance to change in the United Nations, especially when it comes to the Security Council. Most countries agree that the UN needs to reform itself, but few agree on how. And remember, you need the permanent five's approval in order for any changes to the veto system. And thus far, the stance of the permanent five kind of varies. The UK and France are generally more amenable to the idea of some changes to the veto system, though with qualifications. Okay, the whole idea of veto restraint was actually France's idea. Russia and China generally not in favor. And the US is ambivalent, but to be honest, it's probably a big no too. Okay, the US will never give up its veto in its current form. Okay, and this quote from one of the former US ambassadors to the UN, appointed by George W. Bush. He appointed this guy who really hates the UN as a UN ambassador to the UN, really encapsulates the US's opinion on the Security Council and the UN. If I were redoing the Security Council, I'll have just one permanent member, the US, because that's the real reflection of power in the world. Everything else is invalid. Okay. Yeah, so yes, I mean, in recent years this is changing, but in the first 2 decades, like the 1990s and 2000s, after the immediate ending of the Cold War, the US was really in such a dominant position that, yeah, they can pretty much go it alone if they wanted to on almost pretty much everything. Nowadays it's a bit different, I mean, with the current COVID crisis and also Chinese challenges to American power, yeah. Yeah, USA. Okay, so overall, we see that these attempts to deal with great power politics in the UN has been kind of mixed over the years. And the UN has, okay, before we get too critical, just now you'll notice that I keep saying that they tried to reform the veto, but the permanent five were resistant to change, and also it was very difficult to get consensus on how to change it. But why do I still assess UN reforms on great power politics as rather mixed? Is because let's not forget that the UN has survived till today precisely because of the veto system too. Is the only thing keeping the permanent five happy and in the UN and preventing wars between the permanent five. The Security Council can still kind of function, and it has improved kind of in the recent years. And this has let the UN maintain a key role in the world despite great power politics. So before we get too critical, we must also be realistic here. The veto is also what is currently still keeping the permanent five engaged in the UN. So you can't just scrape it all together or reform it totally without taking that into account. Okay? However, at the same time, yes, the veto system is still a problem. It's necessary, but maybe it can be improved. Is this catch-22 situation where, the UN needs the support of great powers to function? Okay, but the great powers also need the support of other UN members now and then. So yeah, it's really about striking compromises at the end of the day. Okay, no compromise solution on the veto likely anytime soon. Next up, we're also going to talk a bit about reforms that have tried to deal with the constraints in peacekeeping phase so far. This is going to get very technical, so I'll leave you all to mainly read it on your own. Okay, first of all, one big issue is funding. And this is a continuing issue since the Cold War era where members often refuse to pay up. Like France and Russia during the Congo crisis, the US very often since the 1980s till the present. Recently, the dearest Donald over at the White House has withdrew funding for the WHO. So you can see how the threat of US withdrawing funding is always a big deal. UN peacekeeping budget has ballooned since the 1990s because of more and more and more peacekeeping missions. Okay, but at the same time, you can see that the contributions to the UN budget is still very lopsided. The US clearly pays the most, still, given its position in the world, but at the same time, that also increases the leverage that the US has over the UN. The next big problem that the UN kind of faces in peacekeeping is that they don't really have a standing force. They cannot respond quickly. They rely almost completely on member state contributions, and it's not always easy to achieve this. Peacekeeping troops often end up to be mostly those from developing countries. Do you know why? Why is it that a lot of peacekeeping troops tend to be from developing countries? Any guesses? Neutral, okay. Political will, neutral is actually a really dumb reason, yeah. Yes, dollars. Guess who pays peacekeeping troops when you contribute troops? Yeah, this is just where UN peacekeepers comes from. So if your country volunteers your troops as peacekeepers, right? The UN helps you pay them, leh. Yeah, so when they're there chilling peacekeeping in another country, yeah, you don't have to pay. The UN is paying for you. Yeah. So the UN is basically paying their salary. Yep. I mean, of course, usually the big powers don't get involved, so because of the principles of peacekeeping laid out by Hammarskjöld that the big powers shouldn't be involved in peacekeeping. But yeah, beyond that, there's also a very realistic financial reason here. Okay, yeah, they can't give money, so they give manpower. Okay, moving on. So, attempts by the UN to reform peacekeeping over the years. Yes, some attempts, funding reforms. They tried to review peacekeeping contributions, but there's still continued issues. Like some countries claim that they're paying too much, some countries say that they're paying too little, continued debts to the UN, and all that. Okay. Operational reforms, you can read up yourself. There's many different ones. Some of the more significant ones include the setting up of a department for peacekeeping operations, setting up a standby arrangement system, the Brahmi report that further enhanced the UN's rapid deployment capabilities, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so this is all technical on the ground, how they tried to make peacekeeping more effective by being able to respond faster. Overall, in terms of how the UN has reformed peacekeeping over the years, it's definitely better today. But continued problems persist, such as funding, such as the lack of a permanent standing army, okay, which is unlikely to change anytime soon, and also the ability of the UN to deploy rapidly, quickly, is still often in doubt. So improvements, but problems still persist. Okay, finally, we're going to talk a bit about how the UN has dealt with the rise of regionalism and the regional power blocks. That means more and more countries and more blocks of countries are banding together to form like regional organizations like NATO, like the European Union, like ASEAN, like ECOWAS, like the African Union, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so basically, power realities in the world are changing. So how has the UN tried to keep up with that? With all these new organizations that have been emerging regionally across the world. And one of the biggest things that the UN has tried to do is try to propose to expand the Security Council to account for better regional representation. Currently, it's still 15 members, 5 permanent, 5 which is heavily dominated by the West, and the remaining 10 is distributed across different regions of the world, but it's not very evenly distributed too. And once again, this is a very controversial issue. Most countries agree that the Security Council needs to be expanded, but few agree on how. Okay, and this often leads to regional rivalries flaring up. So, different attempts to reform the Security Council over the years include Kofi Annan's proposals for a Model A or Model B attempt to reform the UNSC. As you know, Kofi Annan was a big reformer, SecGen, and he tried to push a number of reforms through. Okay, this didn't turn out, but this was what he proposed as attempts to expand Security Council membership. So he offered two possible proposals. One is that you expand the number of permanent members to 11, okay, and also expand the number of non-permanent members to 13 for 24 total. Okay, sorry, got distracted for a while. And so, what happens is that the number of permanent members with veto still stays at 5. Okay, but there'll be 6 more permanent members that are always there, and a few more non-permanent members that are always there. Okay, model A. Another model is to increase the number of non-permanent members to 19. So for a 24-member Security Council. So these were his 2 proposals over the years. Unfortunately, the proposals ran into roadblocks and nothing much came out of it, as you might have imagined, since the Security Council today is still like this. There have also been other proposals other than Kofi Annan's suggestions, which include, for instance, the G4, the group of 4 countries, Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, which are all lobbying for them to have a permanent position on the Security Council too. So that's why, yeah, they are lobbying for that. With or without the veto, they don't mind, but they just want a position on the Security Council, especially given their growing weight in the world today. Generally, there's mixed opinions on this. Like, the US is very in favor of Japan having a permanency on the Security Council. China obviously is a flat no way in hell. Okay, and yeah, you can probably imagine why. There's also been calls such as this group called the Uniting for Consensus to have a greater role for the developing countries, including the African Union, in the Security Council. So once again, you can read up on these different proposals for yourself. In addition, there's also been increasing challenges to UN's impartiality and effectiveness. Sometimes when they use regional organizations and collaborate with regional organizations like NATO, like ECOWAS, like major regional powers like Australia, sometimes it's successful. When in other instances, they were a lot less successful and UN reputation was pretty tainted after that. So for instance, overall, we see that this idea of how the UN has tried to cope with the rise of regionalism, with the expansion of the Security Council, or proposed expansion of the Security Council, is still a problematic issue because nothing much has come out of it. Most UN members once again agree that there is a need to expand the Security Council, but few of them agree on how we should go about doing this. So it's the familiar problem once again that yes, they feel that they should reform, but the question of how to reform is a big question mark. And for now, the Permanent Five is very happy with the status quo for obvious reasons, and little progress has been made on UN reforms over the years. Okay, so overall today, I have looked at how UN reforms, briefly, have tried to deal with issues such as the conflict between sovereignty and intervention. I mentioned that they had this new framework called Responsibility to Protect that seemed very promising at first, but eventually also became bogged down in how exactly is it to be applied. Then, we also talked about how the UN has attempted to reform to deal with great power politics. I especially talked about the veto system and attempts to reform the veto system to address the issues of, great power rivalry, US unilateralism, etc., etc., etc. However, once again, we see that attempts to reform the veto system, there's no real consensus. And for now, the Permanent Five are generally not that willing to consider big changes to the veto system on the whole. I also ended off that section by mentioning that while we might be very critical of the veto system, let's not forget that the veto system was also what has been keeping the great powers, the Permanent Five, happy within the UN for the last 70 years. It's always a compromise, and we must not lose sight that the veto system can sometimes be seen as a necessary evil. Then I looked at how the UN has tried to reform to deal with operational constraints in peacekeeping. Okay, so again, some attempts have been done to improve peacekeeping and how peacekeeping funding, peacekeeping operations took place over the years, but again, mixed bag of results. And finally, we looked at how the UN has tried to reform to deal with the rise of regionalism by attempts to expand the Security Council to include more regional representation. Again, nothing much has been done. I mean, there's been a lot of proposals, but there is no real agreement on what is the best way to proceed. And that concludes this final UN lecture on UN reforms. Allow me to just say a few words to end this all off, because this is really the last. Okay, this is the final lecture and the final chapter of your UN syllabus. So thank you for hearing me lecture over the last, I think, 2 or 3 months. You'll not see me in lectures again until I think late term 3, okay, when we do revision. So yeah, bye for now. It is really the end for the UN part of your syllabus, sorry. Okay, oops. Before y'all go, okay, I'm just giving y'all a heads up first. The school will release more details accordingly in the weeks to come, which is that you are going to have a block exam too. Okay, there's not going to be a mid-year exam. Okay, there's not going to be a full-fledged mid-year exam, but there will be a second block test that is similar in scope and coverage to your previous block test, but smaller overall to your actual mid-year exam. Okay, the topic areas and question types will be similar to your block test. Okay, that means you will have a Southeast Asia source base and also a UN essay, but we'll be testing you on the topic areas and question types that we haven't tested yet. That means in the case of the UN, most likely we'll be testing you on peacekeeping, International Court of Justice, questions on like change and continuity, basically the things that we didn't touch in the previous block test. For the Southeast Asia source base is likely going to be the same. That means we'll likely test you on the ASEAN parts of Theme 3 in Southeast Asia rather than interstate tensions. Okay, more details will be coming your way, but in the meantime, do use your holidays to revise for both Southeast Asia source base and UN essays. Okay, that's all I have to say, and goodbye for now. There's also an exit pass, so do the exit pass as always before you leave. I'm going to link it here. It's also embedded into the main page. Okay, so that's the exit pass. Do complete the exit pass. It's just a short 3 questions once again.